Redraft ends, but Dynasty is life. I'm Theo Gremminger. Today we're talking about Dynasty Offseason Winners. We are about 4 weeks away from the start of the NFL draft. There's been a lot of attention on what you need to do in order to win your rookie draft. But there's also a number of players who simply have gained dynasty value and not necessarily up the dynasty ranks. Some of these players have certainly risen up the ranks because of moves that their teams have made and moves that their teams have not made. But there's other players who improve their long-term outlook and their stability. Guys who might have been diminishing assets in Dynasty that are now looked at as guys that could potentially offer you some longer-term stability and really improve their standing on your Dynasty roster. A quick note for everyone watching this on YouTube: Dynasty Life is leaving PlayerProfiler YouTube starting April 1st. We found a new YouTube home for Dynasty Life. So you need to go and subscribe to Fantasy Points YouTube. There's going to be a little bit of a break where there probably won't be any Dynasty Life YouTube content, but eventually, hopefully sometime a little later in the month in April, Fantasy Points YouTube will be showing some Dynasty Life episodes. So make sure you subscribe to Fantasy Points YouTube channel. And a reminder that in the time being, the next 2-3 weeks, potentially where there's no video content, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast feeds. Dynasty Life Podcast is also leaving Player Profiler's main feed. So if you are listening to this show via the Player Profiler main feed, you can subscribe to Dynasty Life anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, you name it. And anybody watching this show on YouTube, I'm going to put the links right in the show description below. So really exciting stuff. Dynasty Life keeps going on. A big shout out to the Player Profiler YouTube audience who supported my work here for a while. Really saw this show go. 65 episodes in of Dynasty Life. They've all been on Player Profiler YouTube, but it's going to Fantasy Points YouTube. And shout out to the podcast audience who might have been listening on the Player Profiler main feed. You're going to have to subscribe to the Dynasty Life only feed in order to get this podcast. I'm leaving Player Profiler starting in April 1st. There'll be an announcement where I'm going. I'll be able to share that with you guys really, really soon. But exciting stuff for the podcast. The podcast will keep going. And the YouTube home, go subscribe to Fantasy Points. I'm going to put that in the show description as well. So let's get back to it, the stuff you actually want to talk about, the offseason winners. So there's a varying length of players here. This is not just young players. I have a couple of veterans here, but let's just go ahead and start off at the top. Let's talk about Najee Harris. And Najee Harris is a player where you saw his dynasty value spike up when he was a first-round selection years ago by the Pittsburgh Steelers. Of course, he had that exceptional first year in Pittsburgh where Najee caught over 70 passes and was an RB1 right out the gate. For you redraft managers, Najee was a player that helped you in redraft as well. He was a early second-round redraft player as a rookie, and certainly his dynasty value spiked up. And that ended up being sort of a cautionary tale. Najee averaged 17.7 points per game as a rookie back in 2021, and people hoping that that sort of level of production would sustain for him, that went away very, very quickly. 2022, his reception total went down to 41, and his points per game went down to 13.2. So a significant 4.5-point drop from year one to year two in points per game. And the last two seasons, sort of a middling scorer for you, a guy who might be in your lineup, might be a guy who just exists on your bench for depth, was 30th in points per game in 2023 and was 25th in points per game this past season. But Najee was always a guy who was going to land well on the open market. We talked about it here on Player Profiler on other podcasts, but Najee plays every single game. He's never missed a regular season game or playoff game for that matter in his entire career. Plays 17 games every single season. He rushes for 1,000 yards in every single season, and he's scored 6 or more touchdowns in every single season, including 2 double-digit touchdown seasons in year one and year two. Pittsburgh-wise, a lot of questions at quarterback. Najee entered free agency looking like he was going to find a new team, and he ends up getting the best possible landing spot with the LA Chargers. LA was a team that many of us had hoped would select a back like Omarion Hampton in round 1 or potentially a Caleb Johnson in round 2. It was sort of a free square landing spot for a rookie running back that we could get really excited about. It ends up being Najee. And Najee was a player that Jim Harbaugh tried to recruit to the University of Michigan. Harris, of course, goes to Alabama, and that's all she wrote. But Harbaugh has tried to get this guy for years, and now he gets him. And when we talk about LA was 12th in the NFL in rush attempts this past year, and that was with J.K. Dobbins, who, to his credit, started the year out very, very well. They got a lot out of J.K. Dobbins. Also, Gus Edwards and Kamani Vidal. So in terms of the overall quality of the backfield last year, we could say it was a bottom half of the NFL, if not bottom 10 in the NFL teams. Now they add Najee Harris. This is a great situation for Najee. Najee, I think, has the opportunity to be a top 15 scorer, and I'd be surprised if he doesn't return RB2 value. I think that the streak for Najee to hit this 6 or more touchdown total, that's a very safe bet, and there's a chance that he could fall in the end zone 10 times in this offense. The streak for him hitting 1,000 rushing yards, barring an injury, that won't be an issue. Not in this offense. There's a good offensive line. Justin Herbert is the best quarterback that Najee Harris has ever played with, and that's not disrespecting Ben Roethlisberger, but Ben Roethlisberger with Najee Harris was towards the end of his career, not the peak of it. So this is the best quarterback situation Najee Harris has ever played with. An offense that is good, a team that made the playoffs last year, and a coach and offensive coordinator in Greg Roman who both want to run the football. So Najee Harris landed about as well as any player this offseason. And let's talk about the player who is now the new focal point of the Pittsburgh Steelers offense, and that's DK Metcalf. And DK Metcalf, this is one where, talk about a rebound. DK Metcalf was looking like he was going to enter the 2025 season with a brand new quarterback in Seattle, question marks about his usage. Jackson Smith and Jigba broke out in a major way. JSN is only 23 years old and last year had 100 receptions, tied the Seattle record. This is the franchise record for receptions last year. DK Metcalf ends up requesting a trade and ends up landing in a spot where there's been some pushback on the quality of the landing spot. And I will agree that there's some red flags in terms of, can he coexist with George Pickens? Who is going to throw him the ball in Pittsburgh? But at the end of the day, Pittsburgh told you exactly what they think about DK Metcalf, the player, by giving him a contract extension that takes it to a 5-year, $150 million deal. So Pittsburgh is looking at DK Metcalf as a player that is going to be a focal point of the offense. Now, with Najee Harris gone, Jaylen Warren and free agent signing Kenneth Gainwell are currently leading the backfield. Now, Pittsburgh certainly could add a running back in the NFL draft. There's been some who have suggested that Pittsburgh could draft a running back in round 1. I'm not so sure of that. Pittsburgh lacks a second-round pick, and I think that's going to put pressure on them to use that first-round pick elsewhere. Now, Pittsburgh certainly could add an intriguing back in this draft class. There's some really good third-round potential rookie running backs this year. But at the end of the day, DK Metcalf, with the amount of money they spent on him, the writing is on the wall that the offense is going to revolve around him. And George Pickens is due for a contract extension, and I don't think that's one that's ever going to come into fruition. So when we look at DK Metcalf, this past year, he was 12.8 points a game, which was the lowest he had since his rookie season. I think more likely than not, even in a Arthur Smith-led offense, even with a question mark at quarterback, based on DK's potential role in this offense, I think you're looking at 2023, 2022, 2021 levels again for him, which was wide receiver 20 in points per game, wide receiver 24 in points per game, and wide receiver 22 in points per game. So I think DK potentially could give you high-end wide receiver 3 production, if not mid to low end wide receiver 2 production. And DK has a chance to see a massive increase in targets if they get away from the Arthur Smith offense. Now, the red flag here is Arthur Smith, because we haven't seen a wide receiver have more than 115 targets in this offense, but sometimes the rubber meets the road in the NFL. Mike Tomlin, this is his team. So Arthur Smith, obviously this is his offense. But when you look at the lack of running backs who can sustain a massive amount of volume on the roster, you look at the amount of money they paid DK, you look at how the AFC North is really turning into a shootout division, with Cincinnati and Baltimore having two of the best offenses in football, period, and two of the best quarterbacks. The chances for more high-tempo shootout environments exist. So do I think that DK Metcalf is capable of getting 160 targets in an Arthur Smith-led offense? Absolutely not. Does George Pickens cause a problem for him in the short term? Yes. But I think when you look at it, him getting to the 125 target range is a reasonably safe bet based on the current makeup of the roster and the confidence Pittsburgh showed in DK to trade a second-round pick and to also pay him the bag. So DK Metcalf, definitely an offseason winner. Not one of the biggest winners, but certainly a winner. Let's talk about another player who really, really benefited this offseason, and that's Jayden Daniels. And Jayden Daniels is one where Jayden Daniels was absolutely exceptional as a rookie. Led Washington to their first playoff wins in ages. Jayden Daniels takes Washington to the NFC Championship game, like really, really fired away. And when we put into context taking him to the NFC Championship game and winning those playoff games, they had not done so in Washington, win a playoff game, since 2006. So for Daniels to do that in year one was absolutely special. Factor in, this was Dan Quinn, this was Cliff Kingsbury, all sorts of newness in Washington, and everybody sort of batted above their average expectation. Jayden Daniels, as a fantasy asset, scored the second most points ever by a rookie quarterback, trailing only Cam Newton. And Washington this offseason has shown the willingness to not only keep what's working for Daniels, but also improve the situation around him. They know what they have in Jayden Daniels. They went out and they traded for Laramie Tunsil from the Houston Texans, adding a big-time left tackle and filling out a need. Then they went and before the Tunsil acquisition, they traded for Deebo Samuel, which Deebo was a player that could have potentially made this list because he looked like a player that was turning into roster clogger category in Dynasty. And there's certainly a chance that Deebo doesn't fire off this year, but he's going to have every opportunity to do so. Washington had a glaring hole for a wide receiver 2, and now Diami Brown is gone, Olamide Zaccheaus is gone, and Deebo should easily step into a wide receiver 2 role where Deebo gives Jayden Daniels a player who can excel with his yards after the catch ability, which is something that Washington really lacked this past offseason. So Washington added Tunsil, they added Samuel, and they also re-signed Zach Ertz, which I don't think was necessarily the plan for them heading into this offseason. I think based on what they did last year in the NFL draft, I think the plan was Ertz was going to be this bridge tight end and Ben Sinnott was going to take over this year. Now, Ben Sinnott certainly didn't fire off this past year. So they bring back Ertz, who was a safety blanket for Daniels and a player that he looked to multiple times this year. And Ertz gave you tight end 1 production last year. I don't necessarily think Ertz keeps the same role now that Samuel is there. I think the targets will be a little bit more spread around. And certainly Terry McLaurin is going to see a very similar role that he did last year. Washington could still add another offensive piece in the NFL draft as well. So Jayden Daniels absolutely has to make our list as one of the offseason winners. And you can't really raise him up in terms of dynasty value. He is already going off the board as a top 3 quarterback in startups. I think really the argument for Daniels is he a player that you're going to take ahead of Josh Allen and Lamar Jackson? I'm not there yet, but you can make an argument based on the age that Daniels might have a little bit of an edge there to keep going with the rushing ability. I'm not there yet, though. It's Lamar, it's Josh Allen, and then Jayden Daniels. But for Jayden Daniels to be the number 3 quarterback off the board in Dynasty startups, he is a rocket ship in terms of value. This is a player that we really, really like, and I'm certainly going to be aggressive with any opportunity I have to take him in a startup this offseason. We're going to take a short break. When we come back, we're talking about more Dynasty Offseason Winners right here on Dynasty Life.
Rookie. It's all about rookie talk in fantasy football right now. So why not go use all that knowledge to do something other than a mock draft? Chris Jimino won $8,000 with just 2 teams last year, and each draft took 5 minutes. That's pretty good ROI. You can start doing rookie drafts for money today on Fast Draft. The Origins tournament is live. It is the place to go and monetize your knowledge of rookies and use your favorite player profiler host promo code for a $25 deposit match. Now let's go start drafting faster.
Welcome back to Dynasty Life. Theo Gremminger. We're going to talk about Joe Burrow in a second. Quick reminder to the player profiler audience listening to this on the podcast feed. Dynasty Life is leaving the player profiler main feed on April 1st. I'm also leaving Player Profiler. So there'll be an announcement about where I'm creating content this year. I'm really excited about it. But Dynasty Life is coming with me. New YouTube home is Fantasy Points. Fantasy Points YouTube will have Dynasty Life at some point. We're going to have a gap here, though, where it's going to be podcast only. So if you're consuming this on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. We got some very, very cool guests lined up for the month of April. I'm going to be dropping multiple shows, getting you ready to crush your Dynasty rookie drafts. But today we're talking about Dynasty Offseason Winners. And one player we've got to talk about, Joe Burrow. And Joe Burrow was unbelievable this past year. Joe Burrow had his best season as a pro, led the NFL with 43 touchdown passes and 4,918 passing yards. Just insane video game type numbers. Joe Burrow also showed that he has skills as a recruiter and a guy who was pretty good at politics, because Joe Burrow was one of the main ringleaders for keeping everybody together in Cincinnati. He lobbied hard. He lobbied hard publicly to the media, and I would imagine behind closed doors to the front office in Cincinnati, to get things done with Jamar Chase and to get things done with T. Higgins. So both of those players signed big contracts, locking them into Cincinnati, with Chase for the foreseeable future and with Higgins for at least the next 2 seasons. Joe Burrow now has the best pair of pass-catching weapons in the NFL, 2 players he's had immense success with, coming off of this incredible season where he put up ridiculous numbers. Cincinnati has now used about 55% of their cap on Burrow and the 2 wide receivers alone, which is insane. And it's going to create an environment where, unless Cincinnati really drafts well, it's going to be hard to envision the offensive game flow not being shootout friendly. We referenced the investment Pittsburgh put into DK Metcalf. We referenced Baltimore having one of the best offenses in football. Cleveland is going to most likely address their quarterback issue in the NFL draft. This is a conference, a conference where in the AFC North division, there's going to be more shootouts. And Joe Burrow, in terms of the spike week ability, in terms of his incredible passing numbers, this is a player that, right after we talk about Jayden Daniels, Jalen Hurts, Joe Burrow's right there. He's right around the QB5 for redraft and in Dynasty. And if you want to take him as high as the QB3, I have nothing to say about that. I can't really argue against it, because Joe Burrow is awesome and he has the weapons. It's not hard to envision Joe Burrow having a challenge to Peyton Manning type season, where Peyton Manning put up those insane passing numbers. Like, could Joe Burrow set an NFL record for passing touchdowns at some point? I think that that's absolutely in the wheelhouse. Now, we talked about Joe Burrow, let's also talk about Chase Brown. And Chase Brown is a player that there was some trepidation and fear in the Dynasty community with Brown. Brown, of course, day 3 selection 2 drafts ago, ends up flashing as a rookie in a very small end of the season sample size. Joe Mixon moves on to Houston, gets traded for a 7th round pick. Chase Brown enters the year in like a backfield by running back by committee look, where there was certainly more steam for Chase Brown, but some arguments made for free agent signing Zach Moss. It took a little while for Brown to really, really get started. But once he did, he absolutely exploded in terms of his production. Brown was one of the best possible picks you could have made in redraft this past season. And in terms of dynasty value, he's spiked up. He's now, any way you cut it, like a top 15 dynasty running back, 25 years old, and averaged 15.9 points per game last season, including 54 receptions and 11 touchdown scores. And when we take away the first few weeks of the season, first 3 weeks of the year, he failed to cross, failed to score more than 8.9 points per game in any single week. But then once we got to week 4, it was just the Chase Brown explosion. And when you get to the back half of the season, Brown was exceptional. From weeks 9 through weeks 14, he had at least 19 points. In weeks 9 through weeks 15, he had at least 19 points scored in every single week and gave you top 5 running back production in that span. Brown was insane. And this offseason, Cincinnati only brought in former Bengal Samaje Perine in terms of running back competition. So Brown is a guy that should return to a similar role that we saw him in this past year where he absolutely excelled. Chase Brown also is going to benefit from Cincinnati's investment at the wide receiver spot. We talked about how much money was put into those 2 wide receivers along with Burrow. So the 3 guys taking over a large portion of the cap. That's going to create an environment where Cincinnati's going to need to address things like offensive line, defensive line, and certainly defensive back, and even a linebacker this year. They could absolutely use one in the NFL draft. They're way less likely to invest in a high-end running back this draft. If Cincinnati does something surprising in the first round and goes offense, I actually think that the best bet would be them taking a Colston Loveland or a Tyler Warren, and that would put even more pressure on Cincinnati to keep drafting defenders. So Chase Brown is going to have to survive the NFL draft. Cincinnati still probably drafts a running back, but it's probably not going to be a running back who's going to put too much of a dent into Chase Brown's usage. Chase Brown should continue to be one of the better values in redraft, and in Dynasty, he could give you another year where he's averaging 15 points or more. Very exciting player, very exciting offense. Chase Brown, definitely an offseason winner. Another player who certainly won this offseason, Brian Thomas Jr. And Brian Thomas Jr., again, we're talking about a player who it's very difficult to raise Brian Thomas Jr. up higher than like where he's going to go. This is a player that most people are ranking somewhere inside the top 6 wide receivers in Dynasty. Like, this is a guy who is a rocket ship. He's going to be a first-round pick in redraft, first-round pick in best ball, had an exceptional rookie year last year, 133 targets, 87 receptions, almost 1,300 receiving yards, and he had 10 receiving scores, averaged 16.7 points per game. He gave you top 6 scoring in PPR at the wide receiver spot. He was a wide receiver 1 out the gate. Now, Jacksonville this offseason goes out and they hire Liam Cohen, a offensive coordinator in Tampa who had immense success. Tampa Bay averaged like 29 points a game last year. Cohen was awesome. And he talked about using Brian Thomas Jr. in the slot more, using Brian Thomas Jr. in advantageous situations. And when we look at BTJ and his slot usage, it was really minimal. He had a 25% slot rate, which is 52nd among all wide receivers. So if that can go up to like 40% just to get the ball in his hands in advantageous situations, even 35% on some manufactured looks, you're talking about a guy who could go from 133 targets to 160 in year 2. BTJ could be the second coming of peak Josh Gordon. Anybody who experienced the Josh Gordon wide receiver 1 overall year, this could be like Josh Gordon part 2, that sort of scoring output where no matter how the other guys in your lineup hit, Josh Gordon had a chance to win you the week. BTJ could be a 20-point per game guy this season in PPR leagues. And Jacksonville not only goes and hires Cohen, gives him a schematic advantage for what we saw last year, but Jacksonville went out and traded away Christian Kirk to Houston and cut Evan Engram. So when we talk about Trevor Lawrence, 2 of the easy button targets for him throughout his career were Kirk and Engram. Engram was also a player who dominated slot usage. Christian Kirk, of course, had that wide receiver 1 year a few years back. Evan Engram gave you top 5 tight end scoring multiple seasons. So the 2 players on the roster who could give any sort of a challenge to BTJ in terms of cutting into his usage and target share are now off the roster. Jacksonville has brought in Diami Brown, Johnny Munt to compete with Brenton Strange. So there's really not another target earner there. Now, certainly touches for Travis Etienne, Tank Bigsby, and whatever running back they draft this coming NFL draft could be there. And I think that the second leading target in Jacksonville is probably going to come from the draft as well. But BTJ is going to be the offensive focal point. He's an exceptional player, exceptional talent, and his situation became even more involved this offseason. Big winner this offseason is BTJ. And let's stay at the wide receiver position. And let's talk about Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson is another player who's going to benefit from players leaving and his situation becoming way, way more clear. Garrett Wilson last year had the most receptions he had as a pro with 101. He had 1,100 receiving yards. He had 7 touchdown grabs, all career highs. He finished as the wide receiver 18 in points per game, and he averaged 14.8 points per game. So these were all career highs for Wilson. Wilson, of course, in 2023 was coming off of his his offensive rookie of the year season as a rookie. It was all like positives. Wilson was supposed to be the breakout receiver in 2023. Of course, Aaron Rodgers went down with injury. Wilson averaged about as many points in 2023 as he did in 2022. So did take a step forward, but this was one where if you had Wilson, you sure didn't feel like you had a massive score at the wide receiver position. And when we looked at the peaks and valleys of the season, Wilson had this stretch of games between week 10 and week 13 where it was like 3 straight weeks with less than 10 points scored. Wilson's not going to have that problem this year because Devontae Adams is now a Los Angeles Ram. And the Jets not only lose Adams, but they lose Tyler Conklin, who's not a guy who was really a threat to Wilson, but another returner who had some success in this offense. Right now, the Jets, the wide receiver 2 might be Malachi Corley, which is more of a gadget player. It's an offense where we certainly think the Jets are going to add a wide receiver in the draft, but short of adding Ted McMillan at 7 overall or Travis Hunter moving up and getting him and saying he's a wide receiver, New York taking a wide receiver in round 2 is way, way, way less of a threat to Garrett Wilson's hierarchy in the offense than having Devontae Adams playing alongside his buddy Aaron Rodgers. So Garrett Wilson is a player who has been one of the biggest target earners in the NFL over the last 3-year period. He's played with some truly horrific quarterbacks, but Wilson has had 147 targets, 168 targets, 153 targets in 3 consecutive years. I think betting on Wilson to be a 150 target guy again this year is a safe bet. Wilson goes from having to play alongside Devontae Adams to playing alongside a question mark wide receiver 2, and he gets his former college teammate in Justin Fields, where there's some there's going to be some pushback on this one, I'm sure. People are going to say, Theo, Justin Fields is not exactly the perfect passer, but end of the day, I'll take Justin Fields for Garrett Wilson all day long. Justin Fields played with him 2 years at Ohio State. This has been a player where Garrett Wilson has signaled him out many times over as a guy he'd like to play with as a pro. You get sort of the locker room narrative here, where Justin Fields has also showed 2 seasons ago that he can help return value for a wide receiver as his wide receiver 1. DJ Moore 2 seasons ago had his best season as a pro, wide receiver 6 overall, playing alongside Justin Fields. But Justin Fields and Garrett Wilson, like the argument's there. I'm pro Wilson this offseason. To me, he's a winner. But we got to talk about Justin Fields himself, because Justin Fields goes from like dynasty purgatory, where Justin Fields was a high-scoring player in Chicago. Then if you had him on your dynasty roster and you were counting on him, the rug sort of gets pulled out from under you. He ends up going to Pittsburgh, ends up starting the season and giving you top 6 quarterback production over the first month of the year, only to be replaced by Russell Wilson. So Justin Fields entered this offseason as like a purgatory player, a player where he's on your roster. You can't really sell low. And this was a player where you had a lot of question marks about what his 2025 outlook would look like. Well, Justin Fields ends up signing a 2-year deal with the New York Jets. And I love it for Fields, because if you have him on your roster, you now have a player who's going to return very, very solid fantasy football production. And if your structure of your roster is how it should be, Justin Fields is most likely your quarterback 2 on your Dynasty Superflex roster. So Fields gives you a considerable edge when you look at it like that. Now, he's not a perfect quarterback by any means. The guy doesn't win a lot of NFL games, but we're not talking about real life NFL football. We're talking about fantasy football. And this stat is kind of blew my mind, but over Justin Fields' last 24 starts, he has 11 top 5 weekly finishes at the quarterback spot. 11 top 5 QB finishes over his last 24 starts. This is a player that's comfortably in our starting lineups this year. And he gets this new offensive coordinator in New York, Tanner Engstrand, which comes from the Detroit Lions tree, where coached under Ben Johnson as his passing game coordinator. And Engstrand could be an aggressive play caller. Now, certainly Justin Fields is different than Jared Goff, but this is a offensive play caller that you don't hire to go be conservative and boring. I think when Aaron Glenn made this hire and New York brought in Engstrand, they did so to be aggressive offensively. So this could be a real turnaround for Justin Fields. We saw what happened when Baker Mayfield went to Tampa Bay, how he turned things around very quickly in terms of his dynasty stock. Last year, we saw Sam Darnold go to Minnesota, and things turned around for him. Justin Fields has a chance to rewrite his NFL career and do enough this year to either retain this job in New York or do enough that he's starting for somebody else in a year or two and continues this role of scoring fantasy points for us. If you were rostering Justin Fields, this was a great offseason for you. Another player who's a winner this offseason, J.J. McCarthy. This is an easy one. I talked about Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold ends up going to Seattle, signs a free agent contract, paving the way for J.J. McCarthy to be the starting quarterback in Minnesota. When we talk about J.J. McCarthy, we're talking about a player who all he did in college was won the national title, and certainly was a guy that, besides that TCU game, was literally undefeated as a Michigan quarterback. Went 27-1 as the starter, including the 2023 national title win. McCarthy was a player that wasn't asked to do a lot, but every time he had to, he stepped up to the plate. Jim Harbaugh was effusive in his praise for McCarthy, saying how he thought McCarthy was the top quarterback in the 2024 class, did everything he could to kind of talk the guy up. Obviously, coaches do that for their players, but Harbaugh really stood to bat for McCarthy. McCarthy ends up being a first-round pick for the Minnesota Vikings last year, was supposed to take over maybe mid-season, gets injured, misses the entire year, now comes back after like a redshirt season and steps into maybe the best situation ever for a first-year signal caller. Has Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, and TJ Hawkinson as his trio of pass-catching weapons. Just an unbelievable trio there. Probably the best in the NFL when we look at wide receiver plus tight end, 2 wide receivers and a tight end. That it doesn't really get better than that. You get a quarterback-friendly system under Kevin O'Connell that has produced fantasy success for multiple quarterbacks. Talk about Darnold last year giving you QB1 value. Talking about Kirk Cousins leading the NFL in passing touchdowns before he was lost for the season in injury. And then you talk about guys who had short-term opportunities like Josh Dobbs and perform well in this offense. And you talk about the Minnesota offensive line. Get back Christian Darrisaw, who missed the second half of last season to injury. And they signed Will Fries from Indianapolis, a guard who's going to help elevate that line. So J.J. McCarthy, he's a winner this offseason. There's nothing stopping him from starting, and there's nothing stopping for him from having a solid season. And when we look in context of McCarthy versus the 2025 rookie class, if he would have gone back to Michigan, I believe he would have been the number 1 pick in the draft, ahead of Cam Ward, ahead of Shedeur Sanders, ahead of Abdul Carter, Travis Hunter. I think McCarthy would have been a player that would have been the number 1 pick in the draft. Now, could have Cam Ward have hopped him? Maybe. But McCarthy was a player that NFL teams liked. And last year, we saw them draft him in the middle, early in the first round. And now you're going to get to finally see McCarthy starting. I think he's the long-term answer at quarterback and an exciting one in this Minnesota Vikings system. Let's keep it going. Talk about one more quarterback here, Caleb Williams. Caleb Williams, another offseason winner. Caleb Williams, Chicago, similarly to Brian Thomas Jr., when we talk about Caleb Williams, the hire that they made it for their head coach doesn't get better. You talk about guys who are legendary offensive coordinators for us in fantasy football of the last 10, 20 years. Ben Johnson's right up there. Just an absolute miracle worker for how balanced and how effective the Lions were able to be. And Ben Johnson, of course, had elite talent in Detroit. Like, don't get it twisted. It's not like these were bad players, but they were young players playing at an exceptional level. You talk about Ben Johnson overseeing the rapid ascent of Amon-Ra St. Brown, the tight end 1 overall season for Sam Laporta rookie year. Jahmyr Gibbs, just absolute sensation his first 2 seasons in the league. David Montgomery coming over and playing better in Detroit than he ever did in Chicago. Like, Ben Johnson was a guy who obviously benefited from the offensive line, the system there in Detroit in place for the culture and all that. But Ben Johnson was an exceptional offensive mind. And it looks like he's going to be trying to do the same thing in Chicago. Went out and spent all this money on the interior of the offensive line. So we saw this last year with Carolina, where a quarterback that's not so tall, you go out and you sign interior offensive linemen where the guards in the center matter more for the shorter player. It's been an argument for multiple passers that are not very tall. Bryce Young, we saw have a huge improvement from year 1 to year 2, with Carolina doing the same last year. So the Bears went and traded for Joe Thuney. They traded for Jonah Jackson, and they signed a center, Drew Dahlman. Chicago also has the 10th overall pick, and they have 2 early second rounders, picks 39 and pick 41. So Caleb Williams was a guy who last year, of course, was looked at as sort of a can't-miss prospect, was drafted ahead of Jayden Daniels in Dynasty startups, and had a sort of forgetful season when it came to the quarterback position. Also was dealt a really poor hand with Shane Waldron as offensive coordinator. This is a quarterback who had to deal with coaches getting fired, offensive coordinators getting fired mid-season, and this is a quarterback who, of course, the season started out very slow. But when we look at a few things that Caleb was able to do in the second half of the season, he had 3 top 10 weeks in the second half of the season, including a weekly QB4 a weekly QB5 week, and then he had a week where he was QB9. Earlier in the year, he gave you another QB1 overall performance. That was probably the highlight as a pro. But when it comes to Caleb, we have a player where we believe in him as a pro. This is one where we weren't wrong last year. I think we were just a year early. And Caleb might not ever hit. Like, this is a player who's going to be punished because he's not Jayden Daniels, and I get it. But I think at the end of the season, Caleb is going to be comfortably inside the top 10 quarterbacks in Dynasty. I really believe that. I think that the Ben Johnson offense is going to be very beneficial to him. We also factor in DJ Moore, Rome Odunze taking a step forward in year 2, Cole Kmet still there, and I bring up picks 39 and pick 41. That is a perfect opportunity for Chicago to add a high-end running back to go along with DeAndre Swift and Roschon Johnson. Caleb Williams with the offensive line improvements, the coach improvement, and the fact that Caleb last year had 483 rushing yards, which was not something in his profile where we thought Caleb was going to come out and run for a ton of yards. But if Caleb can turn that 483 rushing yards into, let's say, 650 to 700 with improved numbers as a passer, then we're talking about a player who's going to give you QB1 numbers this year. So I am going to be optimistic about Caleb Williams. I think you should as well. And the last two players we're going to talk about, we'll put them in a bunch right here. Ricky Pearsall and Jauan Jennings. San Francisco traded Deebo Samuel. Brandon Ayuk could get moved at any time. And we could be entering the season with the two leading pass catchers in San Francisco being Jauan Jennings and Ricky Pearsall. And I think for us in fantasy, this is creating a potential value. Jennings is a guy who had his breakout season as a pro, had 77 receptions last year, 975 receiving yards, averaged 14 points per game, which was wide receiver 25 on the year. Jennings also showed his ability to put up immense spike weeks with Brock Purdy. We saw the 46-point week, but we also had a 25-point week and a 28-point week. Like, Jennings is going to remain heavily involved this year. And Jennings, this could be kind of what he is. But if we look at the target share last year, 26% target share, this was higher than George Kittle was. So Jennings, now we have a clearer path with Deebo gone. Brandon Ayuk could also be moved at any moment. Brandon Ayuk might get traded before the NFL draft, might get traded after the NFL draft. And even if Brandon Ayuk returns, Jennings is not going to get sort of nuked here. And if Ayuk does return, it's not going to be at the beginning of the season because he's still recovering from injury. So Jennings is exciting, but the player who really could take a huge step forward this year is Ricky Pearsall, who was, of course, the 31st overall pick in the 2024 NFL draft out of Florida. Just a next level athlete. He had a 4.41 40-yard dash, incredible burst score, agility score, all of the metrics of Player Profiler when it came to Ricky Pearsall. This was a player that excelled at the Senior Bowl, excelled at the NFL Combine, and was rewarded for it by being drafted inside the first round. Now, of course, Ricky Pearsall at the beginning of the year gets shot, comes back from that, and comes back and plays, which is obviously a huge thing to overcome. But Pearsall, when he made his debut in week 8, he scored 11 points. And then 2 weeks later, after their bye week, comes out and scored 17.3. Then had a really period of the year where he was somewhat invisible. But then you get to the end of the year, week 17 and week 18, you're talking about Pearsall scoring 28 points and 19 points in consecutive games to end the season. And the usage was great. He had 10 targets and 8 targets. His 2 highest targeted games came in the last 2 games of the season. Ricky Pearsall is a player that I think is going to take a big step forward this year, and he's going to get every opportunity to be the breakout player for San Francisco. We also talk about Deebo Samuel. Deebo Samuel led the NFL in rushing attempts at the wide receiver position. Now, Pearsall's not going to do that, but Pearsall can be used on manufactured rush attempts. He also can be used as the manufactured touch player. So maybe some of those rush attempts for Deebo turn into screens along the line of scrimmage, maybe smoke, just ways to get Ricky Pearsall, this big-time athlete, the ball in his hands around the line of scrimmage to add to what Pearsall is capable of in the red zone and capable of downfield. So Ricky Pearsall, really a interesting one this offseason. All these players are very interesting ones and ones that have gained value this offseason already. Now, we got to keep an eye on the NFL draft, but most of the players I mentioned today look like they're going to enter the 2025 season with a chance to score more fantasy points or equal what they did last year. Really exciting group of players. A big shout out to the Player Profiler YouTube audience. Tons of support you gave this show. Make sure you go over and subscribe to the Fantasy Points YouTube channel. This show will eventually make its way there. And in the beginning of April, this is going to be podcast only. Make sure you are subscribed to the individual feeds for Dynasty Life, especially if you're listening to this on the Player Profiler only main feed. Just type in Dynasty Life anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, Amazon, you name it. And if you're watching this on YouTube, I put my podcast links right in the show description. It costs you nothing to subscribe to one of these podcasts, and it helps us content creators keep it going. Dynasty Life is going to help you crush your Dynasty leagues this season, crush your rookie drafts this season, and anything else Dynasty related, we've got you covered. Look for another episode next week. I'm Theo Gremminger, and I'll see you soon.